when the war ends without the ability to eliminate Iran and the Axis, I believe that will mark the beginning of the Israeli occupation entity's downward trajectory, because it's not fulfilling its functional role of being able to subdue these very movements. And then if you also consider the global support for Israel completely weakening, the West may come to see it as easier and better to deal with a real power through which it can secure as many of its interests as possible, rather than maintaining an explosive and unstable situation in such an important region that's threatening all its interests. So even if we look at the size of the protests in the West and the reversal of public opinion, which I believe it's literally unprecedented. The reversal of public opinion with regards to Gaza is like unlike anything I've ever seen. And that's very evident upon the new generation, who have taken a position different to the older generation. And so when the general situation does not tolerate Israel, that no longer serves the Western Empire's interests.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. I'm Ileana Chan, and this week I'm really happy to welcome back Batool Subeiti. Batool is a Lebanese British energy engineer and political analyst based in London. Welcome back to Global Majority for Peace.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, Ileana.
So we've got a lot to cover today. I do want to say to people watching this, the first part will be on YouTube, the full episode on Patreon. We're just trying to diversify our platforms just in case something happens to the YouTube channel. So please become a patron on that Patreon. And also tomorrow we will have an audio as well. So it will be on Patreon and Spotify and Amazon Music. Okay, so the 2026 National Defense Strategy was just released. So we're going to be talking about this in the first question, but to sort of give context to what our interview was last time you were on, it was just after, about a month after the 12-day war when Israel attacked Iran. But now we're sort of seeing like, I can't do math, but 7 or 8 months on pretty much the same trajectory, I think, but an expansion of US imperialist agenda in the region, but not a shift, I would say, not a pivot. It doesn't seem like. Now, the National Defense Strategy was released on the 23rd of January, and I'm going to quote from the Iran section. President Trump has consistently made clear that Iran will not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. And with Operation Midnight Hammer, he showed that he follows through on his word decisively. No other military in the world could have executed an operation of such scale, complexity, and consequence as Operation Midnight Hammer. And further on, he says, Iran's axis of resistance is similarly devastated. Israeli operations have left Hezbollah and Hamas severely degraded. What is your assessment of the reality from, well, the reality? I could probably just stop there.
Absolutely. I just echo what you started off with, and that was that American imperialism essentially remains as it's always been in terms of its arrogance, its tyranny, its oppression. Those characteristics don't change. It was like that in the past. It remains so today. But the only difference I'd say is now with Trump, it's become so strikingly blatant that he like sits atop the throne of the world, and he has this kind of authority that does not accept criticism, objection, or challenge. So in his classification of enemies, the enemy must either come over to his side or to be destroyed. And with this mentality, he lives in a state of intoxication with this idea of victory, and an intoxication of the fact that no one objects to him and no one tells him no. And so the objective in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran with Operation Midnight Hammer was not to target nuclear program per se. That is the title and the excuse used to project Iran as a threat. The objective from everything that's happening to Iran is its surrender. That's something that Trump openly has stated. He said this last year during the June 2025 war, that he wants total surrender from Iran. And so if they curb Iran's nuclear potential, they consider this to be a sign of surrender. So one could say that Trump achieved a symbolic victory in Operation Midnight Hammer. In reality, though, as we said, Trump was trying in every way to lead Iran towards surrender. It didn't surrender, of course, after the American bombing of the nuclear sites. And so from America's perspective, it will try a higher dose. So now we're at a stage where, after what America has achieved in Venezuela with Maduro's kidnapping, essentially he wants to repeat this same experience in Iran in a similar way in terms of removing the supreme leader. And this is something that he has stated within Truth Social as well, that the supreme leader needs to be removed, even though, of course, for analysts or even just lay people, it's clear that the circumstances are fundamentally different. And what was achieved in Venezuela cannot be achieved in Iran. When we talk about Iran, we're talking about a very strong civilization, a very strong culture, deeply rooted institutions. It's a nation that rallies around its leadership. Who has protected the revolution and the state of Iran other than the nation and the public for these past 4.5 decades? So just to go to your second part of your question about the axis of resistance, yes, of course, America in its hubris believes that they struck the axis of resistance, and that the resistance in Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and the rest of the axis also in Yemen and Iraq has weakened and fallen apart. But I would say the opposite is actually true. And I'd say that, especially as a Lebanese who's seen people on the ground and been to Lebanon several times after the striking open war last year, on the surface, yes, it appears that way. It appears that, and it's actually true, that the resistance has been weakened in terms of its logistical and technical capability, yes. Its ability to confront, especially we're seeing the Lebanese resistance has completely adhered to the ceasefire terms. There is a shortage of conventional weapons and supplies, especially in light of Syria's downfall, the former government's downfall. And no one argues with the technological superiority of the Israeli occupation entity in America. That's always out of the question in terms of its precision. But at a deeper level, the mere will to resist, the mere steadfastness in principles, the strengthening of those principles that happens during war places, I believe, it in a stronger position and places the resistance in a state that is capable of rebuilding itself many times over what it once was. Because what's happened now is the nurturing environment of the resistance, and that is the people that support the resistance, has never at any time been as determined and steadfast in its commitment to the path of resistance as it is today. So, for example, the residents of the destroyed border villages in South Lebanon, as we speak, they're living in caravans instead of homes that they can't afford to build. Despite everything, though, their movement and their life hasn't stopped. They continue to revive their areas to harvest their crops, and they're effectively clinging onto their land. And so this kind of steadfastness and attachment to their land, this deep sense of belonging, would not exist without their commitment to the cause and adherence to the path. And those who live among them can deeply sense how much they are connected to their land and understand how the concept of resistance has now transformed into a way of life. So I would argue that this is actually the most important result of this war, of the Al-Aqsa flood for the past 2 years, is that when someone looks at an entity like Lebanon, looks at destroyed border villages and sees this level of sympathy for the resistance amongst the resistance's community, the lay people, despite the lack of any possibility of reconstruction, this is proof that the resistance is not defeated if the will of the people is not defeated. You know, this is a resistance that is strong with its environment, strong with its people, strong with its principles. And I believe this is the most important element. And if this element falls, then you can literally consider the cause finished. As for the technical means, those things come and go. Yes, they may have destroyed many of the means, but within the spirit, the means can be regained. And this is what the Israeli occupation entity fears the most, because Israel would not be doing what it's doing today if it believed that the resistance was weaker and unable to respond. And that's in terms of attacking Lebanon literally every day. There is a violation of the ceasefire and some sort of assassination. And also now another important point is that the resistance is capable of recruiting. whether in Lebanon or in Gaza, many times more than it was previously able to do so. And that is because of the exposure and the unveiling of their enemy to such an extent that resistance is no longer seen as a luxury option, but an obligatory means to survive for those who didn't even previously believe or acknowledge it to that level. So Israel's assassinations day on day in Lebanon is proof that it fears to a large extent the readiness of resistance. And for this reason, it continues to pursue the resistance in Lebanon and continues to threaten with war. And I believe this is also the path by extension that Iran is following, and all parties for that matter in the axis of resistance. If Trump at the head of imperialism thinks he can force them to kneel, he won't succeed. And that's why someone like Trump thinks in terms of precise surgical operations that strike like a thunderbolt, expecting them to ignite fires and tremors that will bring the situation to an end. It's like that quick wins. But he won't be able to do that because that does not work with the Iranian case, nor with the case of the Axis, nor with any case in the world that embraces the principles of liberation as a creed. In the case of Iran, that's considered as part of its true Islamic faith and identity as an Islamic republic, which I believe makes it free through a belief for which it is willing to sacrifice, and its people have proven that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you're raising about the idea of the resistance being a matter of survival now. It's not just ideology, it's necessity. Because I think what we're looking at in the US as well is just there's a lot of propaganda, which is always the case, but it seems like the marketing of the operations, the actions on the ground really pale in comparison. Now there's such a wide gap. It seems like I really want to make sure that I'm not underestimating in any way the incredible destructive nature of US imperialism or downplaying the dangerous times that we're in. But when we look at, for example, the US kidnapping of Maduro and the attempted regime change in Venezuela, at the time when news broke that President Maduro was kidnapped, people really feared that Venezuela would be the next Iraq. They really did think that this would be the beginning of the Iraq War, and it really seemed like they were reporting as if this was a successful regime change. They toppled the government, etc. And now a few weeks on, that doesn't seem to be the case. The Venezuela regime, it still seems to be intact. Granted, it is a huge blow, and it's a very scary thing to have happened, but it certainly was not, the reality doesn't seem to be what it was reported. Now, a few days ago, Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard issued a warning against Trump that they're more ready than ever and their finger is on the trigger. And this is while US warships head towards the Middle East. Do you think that my rambling assessment that perhaps this is sort of, it signals kind of like a change in US military capacity or capability? Do you think that this is really the case here? And what do you think this means for Iran?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in Venezuela, the situation was different. Venezuela was subdued, as you mentioned very rightly so, simply by abducting the president. And they brought in his deputy, Delcy Rodriguez. The presidency, an institution, of course, that followed the Bolivarian anti-American imperialist state, came to take its orders from Trump or others outside the country and to implement their plans. Essentially, they want to repeat the Venezuelan experiment in Iran. So I don't think it's the case that they want to turn Venezuela into another Iran. Rather, they want to turn Iran into another Venezuela, in the sense that, similarly to what they did in Venezuela, they want to bring down the leadership. They want to bring down Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader. And then whoever comes after is told, either you do what we want or we will make you follow your predecessor. That is, we'll kill you. Those were actually the words of Trump towards Delcy Rodriguez. He literally threatened her, like, we would do to you worse than we did to Maduro, which could literally be taken as an assassination threat. This is an approach, I believe, that will not succeed in the case of Iran, because we're talking about very deeply rooted institutions within the Islamic Republic that are very self-sufficient. And as we've mentioned, that word survival comes into mind because Iran was a country that since 1979 has completely been embargoed and besieged by the whole world to bring down this revolution, to essentially topple it. These institutions, however, the only sense of support that they have is that they are popular and the nation is ideologically orientated towards it. That is that they won't surrender and they'll fight until the very end. So no enemy, no matter how powerful, can subdue them. In terms of military capabilities, the size of US forces in the region, even under maximum pressure, I believe is insufficient to topple a country like Iran through air or naval strikes, no matter how many bombs they drop from the sky. And I believe also a ground invasion is impossible. And we shouldn't also forget that all sources of American power are within the range of the Iranian weapons. Iran's ability to respond by targeting US bases is very important to consider, given the number of US bases abroad, some of which were evacuated as soon as the strike was announced some weeks ago. So while the presence of US forces is a strength when they control territory, it actually becomes a weakness when they can be targeted and harmed. So when a state attacks a country the size of Iran, regardless of the scale of destruction or disruption that could be inflicted on Iran's electronic systems, its infrastructure, its jamming systems, Iran, I believe, is able to overcome this and it won't collapse. And so an operation aimed at overthrowing the system, as we've mentioned, it can't be naval, it can't be aerial. If it involves a ground invasion, it moves from being impossible to outright inconceivable, given the existing realities, unless in one case, and that's if America decides to use absolutely prohibited weapons of mass destruction, essentially, the nuclear option, which would scramble the cards and create a situation unlivable and contrary ultimately to US interests after such a massive strike, especially since Iran, in that case, would not have been a real threatening party. Pretext of intervention to protect protesters. I mean, that's the latest one after Trump claimed victory through Operation Midnight Hammer. He can't use the same argument or reasoning of we need to strike the nuclear capabilities. So protecting protesters does not justify a response of this magnitude or the use of weapons of mass destruction. And also the cost of war is the second issue. If the cost exceeds the profit, and Trump is a very profit business orientated kind of guy, it's not recommended to wage such a war when the cost outweighs the results. So unlike the war that took place last year, which lasted 12 days, that was the prelude to an attempted military strike intended to prepare the grounds for internal movements. That's what it was last year. Last year it was let's strike, and then once we strike, we'll cause so much havoc and commotion that we'll prepare the grounds for the people to basically revolt against the system. But of course, the opposite happened. And so now, in our case right now, there is the preempted internal movements instead of carrying out a possible strike, because during the war last year, the Iranian public rallied around the leadership in the face of the external threat. So now it's the opposite. The protest movement has materialized through the rioters to be exploited and to pave the way for external intervention. So the postponement of the American strike, that everyone was waiting for that golden moment for America to strike, and Iran shut its airspace effectively. All civilian planes couldn't go and come during that one day. The postponement of that strike came after it became clear to America that the protests had really failed, making the mission even more difficult. And the size of the US forces that were present in the region then was limited. So additional forces were sent to the region to reinforcement. And now you have the warships, the Abraham Lincoln, that's come and crossed into the region now. So I believe right now America's waiting for the appropriate intelligence moment that would allow them to achieve really precise targets, perhaps to strike the leader of the Islamic Republic. So they would resort to this option in their assessment because they would want to avoid a comprehensive war that definitely won't be in their interests.
That's interesting. Can you expand a little bit more on these protests? Because, of course, the reports that we're getting in Western media, large-scale anti-government protests, and we're getting reports of death tolls estimating from 5,000 to 17,000. I've heard that on the higher end. And then, of course, it resulted in extensive internet shutdowns. Obviously, with this type of unanimous Western media coverage, it definitely suggests some sort of manufactured color revolution. But can you give us your assessment of what the actual situation is on the ground?
Yeah. So in this round, things did begin with legitimate demands and protests. But of course, it needs to be mentioned over here that those very protests were caused by direct harsh conditions imposed by the West, particularly over Christmas. There was very high inflation. This was after Western companies manipulated the currency exchange abroad to create the grounds for internal protesting that could then morph into chaos and rioting, as we ended up seeing. So the currency within Iran, the Tuman, dropped by around 40% 30 to 40% were the estimates. And just to put some historical context, for 47 years, America have imposed sieges, they've boycotted, they've punished, and they've created extremely difficult economic conditions. And they also impose sanctions on anyone who deals with Iran as part of the embargo. So within this approach, it's undeniable but that very harsh economic realities are created. I'd say it's almost miraculous that Iran has survived throughout all these previous periods of sieges, 47 years of sanctions, whilst adapting to them and building its own self-reliant capabilities across various fields. And so this situation naturally creates a degree of internal discontent because the sanctions place heavy burdens on ordinary people. And so then it's very natural for this discontent to sometimes be expressed through demonstrations and protests. That, may I just clarify, we're not calling for the dismantlement of the Islamic Republic, but for officials to do something about the economic situation. So to be clear, the protests never reached the stage of a revolution, as the West is making it out to be. As you rightly mentioned in the question, external elements did enter into it. If we just look at the acts of violence that occurred against Iranian institutions, who, by the way, Trump did come out and tell the Iranian people, like, reclaim your institutions, capture them. Mike Pompeo tweeted saying, for every Iranian protester, he means rioter, there is a Mossad agent on the ground. These attacks against the Iranian institutions also happened against not just civilians, but against police forces. Some of them were stabbed, decapitated, burnt alive. So we're talking about reaching the points of beheadings. That's obviously outside the scope of protest demands when it reaches to this kind of behavior. And that in and of itself, this extremism, this ISIS-style extremism, indicates external intervention and agendas being imposed. And so it's been very clear that the Zionist entities intervening, America's intervening, Europe is intervening, because also, despite the outward threats made by someone like Mike Pompeo, we've seen that Trump is threatening to bomb Iran. Is this a policy that the United States or Europe applies towards the entire world? Or is it directed specifically against Iran? You had Israeli Channel 14 reporting during the riots that foreign actors are arming the protesters in Iran with live firearms, which is the reason for the hundreds of regime personnel killed. An Israeli commentator, to be specific, Tamir Morag, tweeted that everyone is free to guess who is behind arming these rioters. So since when have Western powers not intervened for Iran for this to be a shock for some? And it's happened many times where Western intelligence agencies and services of the Zionist entity intervene through essential sleeper cells, which are numerous and widespread, that they activate all at once. They receive their funding and their weapons to the extent that they've become very organized institutions of collaboration and linkage with foreign intelligence services. If one just looks at MEK, for example, that has its headquarters in Albania. And of course, the West conspired with the MEK, who supported Saddam Hussein during the invasion of Iran during the 80s. These groups insert themselves into the protests and they carry out acts of violence. And ultimately, the goal of these riots was to overthrow the system and to seize power. But they failed in this. And so that's important to mention. Now, obviously, when horrific acts of violence occurs, killings, beheadings, stabbings, executions at point blank range against protesters and demonstrators and police officers, casualties occur in all of this. So the number is not the main issue. But in this context, it is a real war that's being waged on Iran. These deaths are then exploited to suggest the possibility of foreign intervention from the West to rescue a situation that very sinisterly the West have themselves created, initially through sanctions, boycotts, and punishments. The second layer is them moving on to hijack the protesters that are very legitimate, to market their narrative, and to get all this bloodshed unleashed through a kind of civil war in Iran through their writers, and then to proceed with military intervention. So you can see all the layers of sinisterism from the West. And so the entity, the Israeli occupation entity, and the Americans, of course, they've come to the conviction that the mastermind of the axis of resistance, that is Iran, what they consider the head of the snake, must be struck and eliminated decisively, and that the system must be removed. So this is really what they are pursuing. But what actually happened as a result of these riots, similar to half a year ago in the June 2025 war, the Iranian nation again rallied around its leadership even more because these objectives were early on exposed. And because the Iranians are smart people, they don't want to enter the world of chaos that engulfed neighboring regions and countries when the Americans intervened in popular will and created widespread disorder throughout the region. The Iranian people refused to be led into the chaos, like the chaos that now dominates the surrounding region. And even, I just want to make this point, if we look at those who legitimately protest, we talk about the labor unions who saw the attempted hijack of the labor movement, they instantly made public announcements denouncing foreign manipulation of the protests. So it's important to mention that the Iranian people understand, particularly the leaders of the working class movements that are seeking genuine reform, they know that a country's sovereignty is an important precondition to advancing your struggle, and that if Iran falls to the Western capital, then this shall subjugate its people to a far greater power. So if we want to weaken imperialism, it's fundamental to the working class struggle for liberation in Iran. So just to very well conclude on this point, the two most important factors behind the failure of the latest, as you mentioned and characterized it as the color revolution, latest attempt to overthrow the system, were one is quite technical, and that's the main surprise, and that was disabling Starlink the Starlink internet, and acting intelligently in managing confrontations with sabotage elements. This was a very unexpected, decisive factor, and the riots literally died down after the coordination factor was removed. They were at their peak on Thursday and Friday, and then it just died down on Saturday. So the even more important factor than this, though, as I mentioned, were the near universal popular mobilization into the streets. This made the world realize that this state is strong through its institutions, through its people, and that its people are the ones that protect the state. And so if the majority of Iranians were against the Islamic Republic as a system, and this is what we get told in the West, and if we look at the world is not only supporting the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, but it's punishing the whole population. It's punishing the Iranians through sanctions imposed as a result of the system in place, then I believe we would have seen Iran's overthrow if we're saying that the majority of the people were not fond of it. In the same way that this same people in 1979, the majority of the Iranians overthrew the Shah of Iran. And may I add, they paid a heavy price for it. So it's not like the Iranians are scared of the price to pay for overthrowing an oppressive regime. They paid that price in 1979 against all the odds, against all the superpowers of the world at the time, and they endured an 8-year-long war. So rest assured, if the majority of the Iranians want to see a complete regime change, they themselves would let go of support for the system. They won't heed the call of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, when he makes a lecture or he makes a speech and he asks the Iranian people to show unity. You get millions and millions of Iranians in all provinces within the country coming out and supporting the system and the revolution. So the Iranian people should not be underestimated.
It's really interesting. It just makes me wonder, and I think so here I'm going to be exposing some of my ignorance about Iran. I guess my question is, why was Starlink being used in Iran when you have 49 years of sanctions and really external interference in many different ways? And also, does Iran have a sort of like an internet firewall type of thing like China has, where they've cut off like Google, Meta, basically foreign companies that refuse to adhere to Chinese regulations and law?
Yeah, so of course, Iran has the ability to shut off the domestic internet satellite, the Wi-Fi and the mobile internet networks, but Starlink is external to that. The idea is you have an independent system like Starlink that could enable connection for people that want to connect to it. That's outside the scope of control of the Iranian government. So the biggest shocker of all was the fact that Iran was able to disable Starlink. Of course, in this situation, Iran would want to shut down the internet in such a sensitive time when it knows that it is this coordination internally between the rioters and their leaders, and with those externally who are giving them the orders, that is what is causing these riots. So in these sensitive situations, you would expect the internet to basically die down. It's contrary to what the West was trying to claim, that the system wanted to basically black out so that they can commit atrocities. It's actually the complete opposite. It's through blacking out the internet that they were able to not allow the rioters to coordinate. And then anyone who was actually actively connecting to Starlink, then the Iranians were able to track and to monitor who those individuals were. And of course, those were Mossad agents and considered traitors within the country who were subject to treason laws. So the Iranians were able to capture essentially those sleeper cells that were activated and were able to track them down. And there were thousands that were essentially arrested and charged under that. And yeah, to answer the second part of your question, yes, the internet within Iran isn't the most affordable in terms of social media. So you'd expect to see, for example, Instagram, X, like you've mentioned, Meta, Facebook, those you would require VPN to basically access it. So the vast majority of Iranians do have VPN and can bypass that. But again, it's the security situation of a country that is completely besieged. And you have to consider the extent of the strength of the soft war. And that's something that I believe America has the upper hand in and cannot overcome countries like Russia, like China, even like the Islamic Republic of Iran. The soft power that it has, the power of projection, the power of advertising, the power of the media, of manipulating hearts and minds. So this is part of like a strategy of self-preservation, essentially, and that's to limit exposure to Western content. But again, that's something that could easily be bypassed by the average person that's living there through just a simple VPN connection.
Yeah, that's similar to China. A lot of people have VPN and they can bypass the firewall. But I do still think, just on a personal opinion here, that the firewall actually really has helped to make sure that color revolutions actually don't take root and aren't successful. But yes, I'm just going to jump ahead to Israel, because you mentioned here Mossad's involvement in these really violent aspects of the riots. And in your last interview with us, you stated that Israel is the tool in America's hand and not America in Israel's hand. And this is important to understand. America won't be dragged to Israel's square unless it deems that dragging within its own interest. Now, as the US hold on the empire becomes more precarious, although that is controversial as well as to how precarious it really is, the discourse around Israel being the tail that wags the dog and the greater Israel agenda, it increases. In a recent interview with The Economist, Netanyahu claimed that he intends to completely end Israel's reliance on US security assistance within the next 10 years. As Israel is getting increasingly more exposed for the nakedly genocidal colonial project that it is, it does make sense that its propagandic use has waned. And it also makes sense that the US and Western imperialists would seek to shift all their responsibility onto Israel. But what is your assessment of where things stand today? Because I think, just to clarify on this part, I think I'm sort of talking about the propagandic use of Israel, but obviously there's a certain system and infrastructure still there on the ground. So yeah, it's a very complicated question, but can you like pass through this? Because I'm just hearing so much about like Israel controlling the US, etc.
Yeah. So the Israeli occupation entity will come to an end if the United States decides to abandon it. That's very obvious because Israel cannot breathe without the American oxygen on every level. So, I mean, even that, the very fact that Israel cannot survive without America, that America can very well survive without Israel, explains who has the leverage over who. But of course, it must be mentioned that Israel in and of itself is of a dire need to America in the region of West Asia, which is why it will go to the ends of the earth to protect and to preserve it. As at present, there is no alternative to the Israeli occupation entity as long as Iran exists. Iran has created a state of instability for Israel and is a real direct threat to it. And we are still in the post Al-Aqsa war phase, where the Axis was not destroyed, but the repercussions of this war, according to, I would say, American assessments, even before Israeli ones, indicate that the Axis led by Iran must be eliminated. So it's important for us to understand that this is an American need before it's an Israeli need, the need to get rid of the axis of resistance. And if we understand why Israel was created as that functional role, to play that functional role on behalf of the West, to basically keep the region in check, to ensure that hostile forces and powers can be subdued. I mean, the irony of all of this is that the axis of resistance literally exists, resistance was birthed because of Israeli aggression and oppression. So it's an American need before an Israeli need to get rid of the axis, given the absence of an alternative to Israel that can protect Western interests. So Western interests remain in constant need of Israel, which is why they'll go to the end to protect it. Or at least, the West won't allow Israel to fall at the hands of the resistance. You can say that at the very least. Because in capitalism's nature, capitalism regenerates itself and it regenerates the tools, essentially. And so those tools of hegemony, those, let's say, the characteristics, the attributes of imperialism will remain, but it can take a different shape and form. So if the West wants to get rid of Israel, it would want to do it on its terms and not through the axis of resistance getting rid of Israel. Because if they get rid of Israel, then they're empowered in the region and then they'll take over the region. So what's quite ironic is that now Netanyahu is the one who's asking the Americans not to carry out the strike on just yet, because he's not prepared to absorb Iran's responses. And so if removing the Islamic Republic system doesn't work, if it fails, there will be no choice from the American side but to acknowledge the forces of reality, to acknowledge the balance of power and the power equations that exist on the ground. These are conditions that cannot be bypassed once a strike on Iran ends, should preparations lead to such a strike. So recognition of the existing forces of reality with their interests, I believe that's something that would be inevitable. And that in and of itself would lead to undermining Israel when America has to come to an acknowledgement of Iran's strength and power in the region. It's tried everything it can to undermine the system. This is almost like the last shot, if you will. And it's failed. And even the delay of the strike is because the riots failed to cause the havoc that the West really wanted it to cause. So I believe Israel is a limited, small case. There's a lot of power projection. I mean, even when October the 7th happened, a lot of people were talking about it being an inside operation because they couldn't believe the fact that Mossad couldn't understand or comprehend that such an operation was being cooked for such a long time without its knowledge. But ultimately, I believe that's just falling into the kind of hubris and the propaganda that the Israeli occupation entity has created for itself, where it is this strong, invincible power. I actually believe Israel is a very limited, small case that lacks the fundamental elements of existence on its very own, except for when it's provided through external support. But should that external support falter because of the growing rejection to the entity, because of its growing weakness to achieve those core objectives on the ground, because of the presence of the axis of resistance that isn't going anywhere, and the exposure of its arrogance, its hubris, its aggression, even towards, I would say, allied states tied to American interests in the Gulf and in the region, Israel then becomes increasingly untenable. So if we look at after the strike on Qatar, the region as a whole no longer feels secure with Israel, nor views its actions with ease. In the same vein, interestingly, Iran has become, if you will, a necessity for the Arab regimes, namely because it acts as a kind of line of defense for the Arab regimes against the ambitions and expansionism of the Israeli occupation entity, as the focus of confrontation gets directed towards Iran rather than the Arab regimes. When Israel says from the Nile to the Euphrates, it genuinely means that. Like the Nile, so Egypt needs to feel threatened. The Euphrates, Iraq needs to feel threatened. You know, there's no limits to the greed for expansionism. And Iran is really the only force in power that's confronting that. And also, if the Islamic system in Iran was replaced by a Western aligned system, if we think about pre-1979, you had Israel and the Shah who were fulfilling the Western interests in the region. That system in Iran, that Western system, if the regime change was successful, would play a role in the region and share in managing it with Israel in the same way that it was prior to 1979. And that's something the Arab states do not want because they would be excluded from the American arrangement. So I believe Israel has become an uncomfortable presence, at the very least, even for the regimes allied with the US in the region. And that's why, like we recently heard of Saudi claiming that they wouldn't want to open their airspace to the Americans should a war break out. I was reading similarly today that the UAE have now said that they don't want to do that. So overall, when the war ends without the ability to eliminate Iran and the Axis, I believe that will mark the beginning of the Israeli occupation entity's downward trajectory because it's not fulfilling its functional role. of being able to subdue these very movements. And then if you also consider the global support for Israel completely weakening, the West may come to see it as easier and better to deal with a real power through which it can secure as many of its interests as possible, rather than maintaining an explosive and unstable situation in such an important region that's threatening all its interests. So even if we look at the size of the protests in the West and the reversal of public opinion, which I believe it's literally unprecedented. The reversal of public opinion with regards to Gaza is like unlike anything I've ever seen. And that's very evident upon the new generation, who have taken a position different to the older generation. And so when the general situation does not tolerate Israel, that no longer serves the Western Empire's interests. If Israel is no longer legitimized, it threatens to reach a degree that endangers the entire public order as a result of this exposure, which is why Netanyahu today talks about the media being the eighth front of war, because that's how important it is for them to capture hearts and minds. So I believe Western governments have the ability to change themselves in the way that capitalism does if it reaches a stage where the disconnect between their claimed supreme values and their actions gets exposed to the public. Then they can only adapt and change their methods to accommodate the new situation. Otherwise, they become susceptible to collapse. So capitalism by nature has the ability to renew itself according to prevailing concepts. And I believe that's actually what's kept capitalism more durable than other systems, because of the dominance of interests up to now. But when higher concepts prevail and minds are awake and open, it finds ways to be included amongst them. So if it continues to act against those values that it claims, those values of democracy, those values of freedom, those values of justice, to a degree that provokes a broad reaction calling for change after that exposure, I believe that the system will adjust its interests differently whilst trying to preserve them. And that's really how South Africa apartheid was ended. So when policies become exposed, people no longer accept it, and then it becomes a matter of changing those policies on the outside and finding different tools. And I consider Israel to be one of those tools that could be replaceable if there are alternative tools that find themselves in that image.
It's a really interesting perspective. I have a few clarifying questions, sorry, but one is, I think, this perception that in the region there are many US vassal states. Can you give me your assessment of that? And if that's the case, why can nothing replace Israel? Is it probably not as simple as what I'm saying? And I think you're sort of giving me the answer for why Israel is in an existential sort of position right now, and it will do anything to maintain its ability to exist. So we're looking at some very, very aggressive tactics, propaganda, bribes, probably blackmail, stuff behind the scenes that we don't know about, intelligence, etc. happening. But yeah, and I also want to say that there's an interesting idea that capitalism may be able to prolong itself by sort of rational adjustments, I would say, because so far it feels like they may not have any more rationality left. But I guess we'll see what happens. Like maybe when necessity knocks, they will adjust. But yeah, so can you talk about the US vassal states in the region? You're saying that the UAE won't open up their, I'm really curious about what the shifts are happening at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, when we look at the regimes in the region, the Arab regimes, like if we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, during the early 1970s, the oil embargo, like Saudi took a decision at one point, then it was reversed, meaning Saudi countries like that have the ability and the power, if they wanted to, go outside of the American trajectory and to free themselves, to be able to become free, and to also be able to keep their resources, share those resources with the countries that need it and that matter, and not under this kind of hegemony by the West that it's like security for oil. We'll force our security on you, and in exchange, we'll get all the oil that we want, and that will exploit the region, and the dollar gets pegged to the oil in that case. And that's the kind of, you're basically propping up the dollar and American hegemony worldwide. That's really what the utilization of Saudi Arabia has been. So they have that power. The Arab countries, if they wanted to, could liberate themselves. The problem with the Arab countries is they are simply, in and of their nature, these regimes are slavish. They don't care about principles. Their principles are superseded by all these kind of material interests. But if we look at Israel, Israel is effectively a military base turned into a country. It's not an organic entity. It's not homogenous with this region. It was planted as a hostile entity in the middle of this region in order to act as a striking disciplinary stick to put any country in the surrounding area into its place, whether that's Jordan, whether that's Turkey, whether that's Syria, whether that's Egypt. I mean, if we've seen since the inception of the Israeli occupation entity, the major wars that it had in the beginning were with Egypt, and then it had the war in 1973 with Syria, and then you had the invasion of Lebanon. So the hostility surrounds the whole region. That is done on behalf of preserving Western interests. So in terms of a military base turned into a country, that's Israel's functional role. America needs Israel to act as that base. What are the other bases that America has in the region? For example, it has the Al Udeid base in Qatar, but it's not, you cannot compare having a base in a country that has its inherent components of survival. Like, these countries are countries in and of themselves, made up of people that are native to that country, that belong to that country, have their set of beliefs, cultures, etc. Whereas Israel is a state that was created and founded on the basis of serving that interest. Once America no longer needs that disciplinary stick, once you remove that need, then Zionism in and of itself has no value. Like, this is an important point, is that when we talk about power projection and about Zionism having this inherent power, it only has this power because America, the West, gives it that power because they need it. They consider it a need. Once it no longer becomes a need, then it's just an ideological reality that the West felt like it could turn into there was almost a meeting point between the Zionists and the imperialists at the turn of the 19th century, at the time when Zionism became a professed idea. The idea was, okay, like, this ideology exists. It would serve our interests if we could plant it in this region in Palestine. That's a region of strategic importance. The Zionists had the idea of British East Africa. They had the idea of Argentina as becoming their homeland. Like, the ideology has no value in and of itself until the West feels the need for it. So in terms of what it needs Israel for, it's different to the other Arab countries. It cannot use the other Arab countries in the same way. And the other Arab countries have, I would argue, more agency in the sense that they don't exist out of playing a functional role for the West, but they choose to be dictated by the West because they see that as serving their interests. Whereas I don't believe that Israel can, on a primary level, go outside of Western dictates. If its whole existence and dependence depends on Western support, American support in this case, Britain formally playing that American role, you cannot therefore look at Israel and say that it's able to go outside of those like red lines that America sets for it, because it's wholly dependent on America for its survival. So I think it plays a fundamentally different role in terms of how it was born and came into being, and in the same way that it came into being out of a need and necessity for it. Once the opposite is true, once it goes from protecting Western interests to needing protection, then I think in that case we would see the opposite. We'd see like Western support for Israel actually shrink. But we're in such a crucial turning point right now where if America does not give Israel the support that it needs, Iran is going to crush it. And if Iran crushes it, then you're saying bye-bye to American interests in the region, because Iran will take over with its power and its deterrence that gets imposed on the ground.
Wow, that would be an amazing thing to behold. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about Lebanon, because I think I'm not seeing that much coverage on it basically since October 2023. Like you actually mentioned before in this interview, Israel has been bombarding Lebanon pretty much consistently, despite claims of a ceasefire. And on January 22nd, Israeli strikes in the village of Kanaret, I think you actually mentioned that, did you not? Wounded 8 journalists and 19 others. So a lot has been reported about Hezbollah's leadership being assassinated by the US, but it does still remain engaged in sustained cross-border exchanges with Israel. Given this ongoing and largely underreported Israeli campaign, how would you assess the current positioning, despite what you mentioned before, that the equipment and perhaps some of the logistics have been damaged?
Yeah. So very quickly on this one, the resistance is rebuilding itself whilst Israel is increasing its attacks and attempting to eliminate it. The speed of reconstruction, reassessment, and reorganization within the resistance, along with the development of new tools and methods, is faster than the attempts to destroy it. So I believe the entity's intelligence data, its bank of targets, has become outdated and has exhausted its objectives. And now Israel finds itself on the dark side of new preparations, which is what is a big cause of concern for it. But from the side of the Islamic resistance of Lebanon, now is not the time for a major battle. It's not in the interest of the resistance to throw themselves into a confrontation at the present time, despite the psychological pressure that these attacks are creating within the Lebanese context, i.e., you actually have a supporting environment for the resistance that wants the resistance to respond and wants it to restore that sense of sovereignty that's being stripped away. So when preparations are complete and it's proven to the nation that diplomatic means have failed to deter the aggression and to preserve the country's sovereignty, then I believe the resistance will inevitably resume its actions to achieve its goal of liberation. On the regional level, once the existence of the resistance's actions and the resistance axis is acknowledged and recognized, I believe the shape of the region and the nature of the confrontation will change entirely. So, really, interest is what determines the resistance's response rather than how its image will look if it chose not to respond. The resistance is, just to conclude, in a phase of rebuilding itself, a rehabilitation. And so, entering into a full scale war now is not its interest. And if it responded to Israel's attacks, its assassinations, then that would risk it turning into an open war. But I would also say, likewise, it's not in Israel's interests either at this stage to enter into a full-scale war. Israel is rather comfortable right now with its position in Lebanon. It can strike as it will, and it's not really receiving a response. And so a full-scale war within this framework, I believe, is unlikely. And here you can say a certain military equation is formed regarding the degree of Israeli encroachment or violation against Lebanon. And that is, there is a level of growth and recovery for the party, and there is a level of strikes aimed at obstructing this party and its growth. So if the obstruction of the resistance increases more than the party's growth phase, then a larger confrontation can be expected. But if the resistance, its growth, its recovery, its rehabilitation is faster than the attempt to obstruct it and to bring it down, then I think things are expected to remain as they are. So just in short, the stronger the resistance is, the more deterrence is basically created, is what I'm trying to say. From a strategic standpoint, the resistance does not want to appear as the side that also holds the decision of war and peace. It wants to push the Lebanese state to take positions that align with independence and sovereignty, so it doesn't look like the resistance is dragging the whole country into a kind of war. So it actually expects this from the state, and it wants to demonstrate to the general public, not just the Shia base, the Shia Muslim base, but all of Lebanon and its various components, so that they reach the point where they feel resistance is necessary. They feel it's essential. They've seen almost a year and a half now of non-persistent attacks on Lebanon, and that they see that the resistance is necessary to stop this encroachment. Because despite the silence and despite the lack of response, these violations continue to increase. And all of this is creating a kind of public pressure, a demand to defend Lebanon's sovereignty and dignity, and to respond in some kind of form to preserve the sovereignty from these actions. So actually what these strikes are doing is it's increasing the position and the stature of the resistance within Lebanese civil society, and making it more popular so that it is justified whenever it does decide to attack, when it feels that it's stronger, and then is the time.
So right now, basically, to clarify, you're saying that there is still this conflict within the country. And lastly, I would like to talk a little bit about, because the last time we talked after the 12-day war, we were talking about maybe some different alignments sort of happening geopolitically. We talked about how Iran was using the Chinese Baidu instead of GPS, and that perhaps Russia or China, in terms of the J-10 jets, would maybe provide some actual military weaponry for Iran. And of course, Iran and Russia has had pretty long-standing partnerships in certain ways. But can you sort of give me an update on that? And also, when we look at the multilateral world, which we hope to see in our lifetimes, Where are the shifting alignments and alliances emerging right now in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of this goes back to the hegemon's policies. Ultimately, its policies trigger the kind of alignment that you're discussing. With Trump today considering himself the unchallengeable decision maker and wants to directly steer all events that concern him, placing Iran amongst his priorities. He has an agenda that's clear, that's not hidden. It's, you could say it's declared, it's exposed. He calls things by their name. He basically wants to occupy, he wants to administer other countries, he wants to seize their oil without disguise, without embellishment. He has appointed himself, as I mentioned, as this kind of like ruler of the planet in a manner that's not open to objection. And really, what is driving Trump towards all these interventions and to this level of brutality in various regions of the world, his focus on the scale of US debt and really America's decline in the face of competition with China. So he wants to seize energy resources to control the world's economies and others' wealth, and to take over rare minerals that would give America technological and commercial superiority globally. When we talk about American debt, it's about 32 trillion. It requires control to be able to resolve this crisis. So Trump is really looking for easy fronts, like the Caribbean in his backyard. If he doesn't find a solution, he wants to control the global economy. I mean, what is economic control? It means controlling energy routes. That's an important matter, as well as controlling important and rare minerals. So when we look at Greenland's location, for example, it's very important. It's between Russia and China. When we look at an entity like Europe, for example, we're seeing now a fracture between Europe and America because America likes the strong players and then looks at Europe and it sees that it has very little role in what's happening in the world. They're like little students of the Americans. They don't have any military power, whereas you have 700 American bases that exist outside of America. Leadership and cost is controlled by America, and Trump has left no margin for them to move because they can't be relied on. So that is the reality in terms of America and Europe. Europe didn't escape Trump's insults, his bad manners, his crude approach to domination and arrogance, and yet they submit to his will because they have no alternative. Now, when we look at entities like Russia and China, they also, to some extent, their interests might supersede principles. So, for example, with Trump talking about placing the extra tariffs on China, or to be honest, any country, but this predominantly affects China because the vast majority or the highest trade that Iran conducts with any other partner is China. We'll see if it stops trading with Iran in the face of those extra added tariffs, for example. People are asking the question, would countries like Russia and China intervene if Iran came under threat, for example, militarily? I mean, they watched Syria fall, especially Russia. And in fact, what was suggested or what appeared was that deals were made behind the door and that Bashar al-Assad was kind of handed to his fate in that sense. So it's not clear, because the interests between Russia and China with America are grand, in the sense that nor China nor America wants to kind of disturb the equilibrium of that interest that's continuing through trade. It's too big to overcome, basically. They wouldn't want to jeopardize that for smaller alliances that are less significant. So when we look at Trump's ambitions from Greenland to Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, Panama, and what is happening with Iran, we must also not forget the way that he deals with Ukraine and Russia. He claims to end world wars. Well, he's the one that literally creates the conditions for them. I don't think this can continue if any party begins to challenge him and manages to break Trump's will. I think that's the crux of what you're asking. When will it reach that point where there will be that literal head-on challenge to the American hegemony? I believe Iran is actually leading that fight. So with Iran, matters can very well be turned upside down on its head. We could be seeing a turning point that cuts short all of Trump's euphoria over the victories in the Caribbean and his self-appointment as absolute ruler on the throne of this earth without any challenge or objection. If this rule of Trump's is broken, I believe that will lead to defeats following other defeats, and other forces will be encouraged by the realization that Trump and America are not like this great idol that's like capable of everything, especially since there is a comprehensive shift, and this is supported by the comprehensive shift in global public opinion, rejecting and finding unacceptable that domineering, authoritarian, brutal American approach in tyranny. Others will realize that his power is actually based on a supposed detestable aura of prestige rather than actual action, which, as you mentioned in your question, encourages the formation of those alliances to protect the interests of harmed or targeted countries. So this could eventually create genuine independence for them in the future. So the widespread popular rejection of this type of hateful arrogance causes people to resist such interventions. And as long as populations, I think, remain aware and active against it, then he won't be able to persist in this direction. So when we look at a country like Venezuela, I really do believe it comes down to the people, and how much does it matter to the people to not be subjugated under American hegemony and to come out on the streets and to make that popular demand. But ultimately, right now, I see that Iran is leading that fight. And if the Islamic Republic decides to remain persistent and strong and shows that actually Trump isn't, the hubris is really not the reality, then that will encourage, I believe, other nations to follow suit. That will make Iran stronger, and the powerful players respect the strong. So if Iran is strong, then it won't be thrown under the bus. It will be respected by China and Russia, and that kind of alliance will kind of ground itself and increase in strength.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really tricky one because I know that a lot of people, especially in the West, always look at Russia and China. Now, actually, anytime something happens, they were like, why doesn't China do anything? And I think from my examination of what China is doing, or their process and their concept of what it would mean to have a multilateral world, they, first of all, have not invested in that type of military infrastructure that the US has across the world. I mean, they don't have 900 military bases like the US. And I do think the escalation would be so extreme if China was to enter militarily, but I also understand the frustration as we're just watching Iran, like you're saying, be on the front lines, seemingly with limited support. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on to Global Majority for Peace. Even though we're talking about war, we do ultimately want peace. It's just that, like you're saying, this is such a pivotal moment, and hopefully Iran will prevail. So
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching. See you guys next week.